I'm Dr. David Waterhouse, Senior Curator of Natural History and Geology at Norfolk Museums Service, and I'm an evolutionary biologist and paleontologist. Join me in How to Dig Up a Tyrannosaurus, Adventures in the Midwest of America. Welcome to Jurassic Park. Well, actually, welcome to my shed, which is where I'll be talking to you from. But whilst we're on the subject of Jurassic, did you know that those films should really have been called Cretaceous Park, as the vast majority of the dinosaurs featured in them were actually from the Cretaceous period, 145 to 66 million years ago. This geological period gets its name from creta, which is the Latin for chalk, something that we have an awful lot of here in Norfolk. Although our rocks are from the same time period, we don't get any dinosaur fossils here in East Anglia, and that's because we were covered in a shallow tropical sea at this time. We do get marine reptile fossils, as well as millions of belemnites, sea urchins and sea sponges. And of course, the younger sediments of Norfolk are amongst the best in the world for finding large mammal fossils. What we miss out on in dinosaurs, we make up for in mammoths. We will be going back some 66 million years during the course of this talk, but first of all, I'm going to take you back to 2003. Before most of you were born, I'm sure. So how did I become involved in an American dinosaur excavation? Well, I was a 23-year-old PhD student at University College, Dublin, in the wonderful Republic of Ireland. And to supplement my teaching income and scholarship, I was doing some scientific illustrations for various paleontologists around the world. Dr. Luis Chiappe from the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County, and a world-renowned dinosaur paleontologist, asked me to draw some rare bird fossils for a scientific paper he was working on. He said he could pay me in one of two ways, with money or by flying me out to the States and allowing me to take part in a Tyrannosaurus rex dig. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, and of course, I nearly bit his hand off. I flew over 5,000 miles to LA, itself a really interesting site for fossils, being the home of the Brea Tar Pits, where thousands of unlucky animals such as direwolves, short-faced bears, ground sloths, saber-toothed cats and Columbian mammoths, as we can see in this life-size model, are preserved in bitumen seeping naturally out of the ground. Much more recently than the dinosaurs roamed the earth, of course. Although the excavation leader was based in LA, it was the state of Montana in the Midwest that we were headed to dig up our dinosaurian trophy. The rocks which contain the dinosaur are known as the Hell Creek Formation and represent the time just before the dinosaurs were wiped out 66 million years ago. They're to be found in Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota and Wyoming. The very name, Hell Creek, doesn't exactly sound inviting. Nevertheless, I was soon travelling again, this time by car and truck, 1,500 miles through California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, and finally to Montana. And the drive wasn't exactly without its drama, but the least said about getting stopped by state troopers for speeding, the better. The team came from the US, Germany, and Luis's home country of Argentina, as well as me from Britain. And we bonded whilst travelling, staying in motels, drinking coffee, and eating huge cinnamon swirls for breakfast. We finally reached the tiny town of Ekalaka, Carter County, in Montana, 3 days later. It's cattle country, and its name, the Badlands, didn't seem to make sense when we arrived, as we were surrounded by lush grasses, rivers and creeks, and dogged by constant heavy rain. The trucks slipped and slid on the muddy roads, and just finding a spot to set up camp was a treacherous business. Doug, a former US Marine, an all-round nice guy, inexplicably decided he could bound across a stream in our path. It took him quite some time to dry out afterwards. With 3 vehicles, we were just able to reach our camping area, provided by a local friendly rancher, but not without several stops to tow each other out of the mud. Finally, we arrived at the idyllic campsite in the middle of nowhere. The rain was beginning to subside, and there was plenty of room to set up tents away from the nocturnal snoring of colleagues. All seemed tranquil, but as I was to find out, there were still many hazards. Not least suddenly contracting hay fever when I'd never had it before because of new North American grasses I was exposed to. The toilet roll in my hand on the right of the screen here shows just how sneezy I became. Apart from allergies, there were other risks. Rattlesnakes abounded, and as the nearest hospital was a 4-hour drive away, it was best not to get in their way. Of course, Doug, being a macho sort of bloke, didn't think twice about handling them. This one's just a baby. But he has lots of experience with reptiles, even having an alligator as a pet back home in LA. And I'm not sure his cleaner was too happy about feeding it whilst he was gone. Although I'd handled reptiles before, I didn't fancy taking a risk on a rattler. This non-venomous rat snake that lived near my tent was much more my style. Camp was near the site where the previous year some T-Rex bones had been discovered, but it was still a drive to get to what became known as T-Rex Butte. Butte being the American term for the small hills that are found in the area. The area was fast drying up, and roads had to be made in order for us to get our vehicles near, and this was all before we saw any fossils whatsoever. Once the roads were cut, driving to work in the morning was fun, apart from stopping to undo barbed wire gates every so often, which became quite a bore. The landscape of the Badlands is straight out of a cowboy movie, or a Wile E. Coyote cartoon. And by the time we were actually starting to dig, the rain had completely dried up, and the area was living up to its name. For a pale Welshman like me, I had to take precautions against the sun. As well as strong sun cream, a bandana and cap were essential for keeping the dust out of my face. First of all, though, how did we know that there was a T-Rex to be dug up? Well, as with any fossil dig, that involves a little luck. A local man called Bob Curry was out walking the Badlands in Montana and found what turned out to be Tyrannosaurus bones weathering out of the sediments on government land near Ekalaka. He followed the trail up the butte, and more bones were sticking out of the face. Next comes Luis Chiappe and his team to investigate, and before you know it, with some permissions and paperwork to fill in first, we were digging up a T-Rex. So here it is. T-Rex Butte, Ekalaka, Montana. My office for the next 6 weeks. Supplies still had to be carried in the last few hundred metres, including the tools of the trade. And it's not like in the movies, where a couple of paintbrushes are used to dust off a perfectly preserved, articulate dinosaur skeleton. Oh no, some serious kit is needed to dig up a Tyrannosaurus. Okay, so we've heard about some of my adventures. So what about how to dig up a Tyrannosaurus? Well, you need everything from pneumatic road drills right down to dainty dentist tools and everything in between. And here's the excavation site after what's known as the overburden has been removed by the larger pneumatic tools. Long days of painstaking work laying in the dirt in the hot sun. I got to work on one of the largest bones, one of the femora or thigh bones. But here we see part of the right mandible, the jawbone, complete with razor-sharp tooth. And to give you a better idea of the size of it, here's a replica that I happen to have. They're sometimes referred to, rather facetiously, as deadly bananas. But you can see why. They're literally as big as a banana, up to 20 centimetres. but have a serrated edge along one side, like a steak knife, and with around 60 of these and a 4-foot-long jaw, which could possibly exert up to 5 tons of pressure, you've got one bone-crushingly deadly bite. And here's a piece of a dinosaur that they were certainly feeding on. This is part of the neck frill of the almost as famous Triceratops, named after the 3 horns on their face. And we can see just how fossilization works on dinosaur bone that's around 66 million years old. Unlike the mammoths, giant deer and bison preserved from around 1 million years ago in Norfolk, which is technically semi-fossilized, most of the organic matter, the bone itself, has been replaced here by minerals. It's literally been turned to stone. But these fossils are beautifully preserved. And on this piece of Triceratops, you can actually still see the channels in the bone where the blood vessels sat in. Now, you might think that this bony frill was used to protect the dinosaur's neck against the ferocious bite of a T-Rex. But this might not have been the whole story, as some specimens show Tyrannosaurus bite marks actually puncturing the frill. They were probably mainly used to attract mates, as a way for members of the same species to recognise each other. And the blood vessels running through them may have helped to add a splash of colour to their neckwear. Now back to the dig. Over the days and weeks, my part of the site became clearer. And you can see here the femur, a huge rib, and fibula, which is part of the lower leg. However, other bones weren't so complete, and some, like this metatarsus or toe bone, were more like a giant 3D jigsaw puzzle. Here we see the pelvis. And the skull was smashed and mangled by time and the huge pressure of rock above, so that it was almost unrecognisable. Back to the how-to part of the talk. What is the process of excavating a huge and important fossil such as this? Well, first you need to carefully remove the rock from the top and sides of the bone, being careful not to damage the bone itself, which is a pretty similar colour and texture to the rock. Once you've done this, you begin to jacket the top and sides of the bone in plaster. But of course, if you just stick plaster on, you'd have a lot of trouble getting it off again. So a barrier layer, usually aluminium foil, is added on first. Then plaster bandages, then more plaster, and often a strengthening pole such as a metal rod. When this is done and dry, you dig underneath the fossil, leaving a few pillars of rock for support. You flip the bone over, remember, these can weigh several tons, and do the same on the underneath, which is now the top. Then you number and name the jacketed specimen, so that you know what's in there when you get back to the lab. For the one femur that I was working on, it took 5 people to carry off-site to the truck. But for larger pieces, such as the pelvis or skull block, it's impossible to move with human muscle alone. The solution is surprisingly low-tech. A tripod of scaffold poles and a hand winch. You simply set the tripod up in front of your fossil block in the direction you want to move it. Then you attach an extremely strong sling around the block. You winch it up and forward very slowly, and repeat the process until it's in the back of the truck. Easy. But working very hard during the hot days means that you have to have time to relax during the evenings. And this is real team bonding time. After a fantastic meal cooked by our Argentinian friends, it's time for recreation. And what better way of winding down than lassoing the German paleontologist? Or even a fashion show featuring a world-renowned dinosaur expert, although the least said about that, the better. The evenings and Sundays weren't all fun and games though, as during our stay there were some quite serious thunderstorms and even a tornado, despite me being reassured that tornadoes don't reach Montana. And there were a couple of hairy moments with lightning striking within metres of me at our camp. But the Tyrannosaurus dig wasn't the only thing we were doing in the Midwest. After the main excavation in Montana, we went dinosaur prospecting in the neighbouring state of Wyoming, as future field seasons always need to be thought about. A hadrosaur or duck-billed dinosaur was the prize this time, something to go back for after all the red tape was sorted out. And here I am on what looks like a very normal butte, but this picture is extremely important to me. I'm actually sitting on the very layer of sediment when the dinosaurs went extinct. This slightly darker brown deposit is known as the KPG, or the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, and it's from around 65.5 million years ago, and contains the element iridium, blasted halfway across the globe when a meteorite hit the Earth in what's now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. Which means that under my feet you get dinosaur fossils, but above there are none. So what to do with half a Tyrannosaurus in the boot of your car? Well, you have to get it back to Los Angeles, and a 4-day drive is the only way to do it. Of course, we were considerably slower on the way back, due to several tons of rock and plaster in the trunks and trailers. This took its toll on the tyres, and there was quite a spectacular blowout at one stage, where a whole section of tyre ripped off. There was time for stops on the way back, and Denver, Colorado had some lovely museums, including this reconstruction of a Tyrannosaurus rex leg, the very part I'd been working on during the excavation. It gives you a really good idea of just how huge the dinosaur was, and even a Smilodon saber-toothed cat model to stick my head in. The Rocky Mountains were beautiful, even if we did crawl along at stages because of the huge loads we were transporting. And of course, you can't go through Nevada without a quick stop-off in Las Vegas, can you? Although not many get here with a T-Rex in the boot. There's a Madame Tussauds in Vegas, and as casinos aren't really my thing, this was a good place to visit. My musical hero, Sir Tom Jones, was of course my favourite exhibit, and in 2003 George W. Bush was president. But there is a little-known natural history museum in Las Vegas too. This small museum had a temporary exhibition on whilst we were there, and it just so happened to be about another excavation by our dig leader, Dr. Chiappe, this time in Argentina. It was quite surreal seeing wax models of the people you'd become so accustomed to, and a mural even contained a painting of my PhD supervisor, who was on this particular South American trip. You can see Dr. Gareth Dyke sitting on the floor in the bottom right of the artwork. The journey ended when we returned back to the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County in California to a hero's welcome, a photo shoot and a slap-up meal in the city's Chinatown. But that's not the end of the journey for Thomas, as this T-Rex became known, named after the original discoverer's brother. After 6 weeks of digging, there was still much more of this huge creature's bones left in the ground, and it took a further 2 years of fieldwork to excavate the rest of him. I had to return to Dublin to finish my doctorate, but the work continued in 2004 and 2005. In the end, 80% of Thomas was recovered. Not bad for 66 million years in the ground. In fact, he turned out to be one of the most complete Tyrannosauruses ever found. But even getting him back to LA wasn't the end of the story. In fact, in many ways it was just the beginning, as it took a further 6 years to prepare the fossils out of the sediment and make them stable enough for research and display. Finally, in 2011, 8 years after the initial dig, Thomas was revealed in the central rotunda at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. As well as being one of the most complete T-Rexes ever found, he was also the youngest geologically, amongst the last dinosaurs to have existed. And at 10 metres long, not even fully grown. Turns out Thomas was a teenager. So what killed this 17 or 18-year-old before it had even reached its prime? Well, the answer is we don't really know, although there are a few clues. Inside the skull there's a bone which, in other tyrannosaurs, is structurally important in helping with those huge bite pressures. Thomas's bone has a hole in it that we know was there when he was alive because it shows signs of healing. Could this have been the site of a tumour which killed our tyrant? However you look at it, there's so much more to discover about Thomas, as well as Tyrannosauruses as a species. For such a famous dinosaur, there are actually only a handful of near-complete specimens like Thomas, many of which have also been given nicknames such as Sue, Stan, Scotty, Tristan and Trix. But Thomas is important among these. He is the geologically youngest T-Rex ever found. He was certainly amongst the last of his kind, and probably saw a world that was increasingly uncertain due to climate change. Sound familiar? Now, the name Tyrannosaurus is ancient Greek for tyrant lizard, and Rex is Latin for king of the tyrant lizards. But actually, dinosaurs weren't lizards at all. Believe it or not, birds are a type of dinosaur. They're known as avian dinosaurs, which means that T-Rex is actually more closely related to the robin in your garden than it is to any lizard or crocodile. Now, what about what Tyrannosaurus looked like? So we know that they're related to modern birds, and they possibly had a layer of feathers, at least along the top side of their bodies. Next to that iconic name, Tyrannosaurus rex, did you know it was originally going to be called Dinosaurus imperiosus, which means powerful mighty lizard, but due to a mix-up with some other dinosaur remains, T-Rex stuck instead. Now it should always be spelt with a capital T for Tyrannosaurus and a small r for Rex. There should never be a hyphen between T and Rex, unless you're talking about a 1970s glam rock band. It should always be T full stop Rex. And you'll see it written in those slanting italic letters, just to show it's a proper scientific name. Studying fossils and our ancient past isn't just an interesting pastime. By finding out what happened long ago, we can begin to understand our own future. Who knows, you could be the next paleontologist to study Thomas and his relatives. But for now, there's plenty more to learn. There's even a Thomas the T-Rex book, which features many of my photographs that you've seen in this film. But don't worry, I don't get any royalties. But you certainly don't have to go to America to find fossils. Right here in the UK we have plenty. There are certainly dinosaur fossils to be found further west in the British Isles, and here in East Anglia we have the Deep History Coast, where the oldest archaeological site in northern Europe, Happisburgh, revealed the earliest evidence of humans in Britain. West Runton in North Norfolk is the site where the largest and oldest nearly complete mammoth skeleton in Britain was discovered, the West Runton mammoth. Bison, giant deer, hyena, steppe mammoth, wild boar, giant beaver, forest rhino and bear fossils from around 1 million years ago are being found all the time along our coastline. And anyone can pick up any number of belemnites, sea urchins and sea sponges that are around 90 million years old. That's even older than a Tyrannosaurus.